I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 40 of EO Radio Show. This is the second in our series of quick tip episodes, starting with the details of state registrations of nonprofit corporations. In episode 38, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Many also carry out activities in Nevada and Arizona, so those states are the focus of this episode. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we will talk about the basic filing requirements for nonprofit corporations in those two states, Nevada and Arizona. We'll work our way through the other states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed previously in episode 38, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like people. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the state laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, nor whether to incorporate at all. Sometimes a different form is better, such as an LLC or a trust. But instead, today we're focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. I'm happy to be joined again by Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal here at Farella, and he specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular, charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate acquisitions and vendor contracting. He has also worked for Morrison & Foerster in their intellectual property litigation group. Welcome back, Joe.
Hey, it's good to be here, Cynthia.
Let's talk about Nevada first. For a nonprofit that's already formed in another state, I guess my first question is, what does that organization need to do in order to do business in Nevada? And similarly, I suppose, if a new entity is being formed that's only going to operate in Nevada and wants to just incorporate there, what documents do we look at?
In Nevada, it's interesting because the form works for both a formation there in the state and for registration of a foreign entity. This is unusual. It's different from what we talked about in California a couple of weeks ago and from most states, really. What they do have is a two-step form. They have a formation nonprofit corporation form and an initial list and state business license application. So you do one and then the other. We talked a little bit about what entails a foreign entity prior. I think we kind of discussed that in terms of being in Delaware or formed in California and then going somewhere else. You referred to as a foreign corporation, but just to remind all of our listeners that just means they're not in that state. We use domestic and foreign in a much more smaller sense of state to state versus country to country here. It's the same idea, but I don't want the listeners to think that we're talking that you formed somewhere else.
Yeah, so today we're talking about foreign in the context of not incorporated in Nevada at this particular point. So both of those, they start with the same form.
That's correct. And
okay, gotcha.
That first form, the formation nonprofit corporation, actually has a simple checkbox where you note whether it's forming there in Nevada as a new entity or if you're registering a foreign, if you're registering your Delaware. And then from there, it's just a simple fill in. They have a quick section to fill in what you're doing, just a basic as a 501c3. It's nothing complex versus what we talked about more with California or with Delaware, where you have much more of a broader language base into it. Then the initial list that follows with it, it actually has to just be filed before the last day of the first month following the initial registration date, which is kind of a lot of speak for those, it's like when you start a new job and your insurance starts the next month after, not the month you're in, but the month after. Same idea here with the initial list. So if I file today, May 4th, my formation, my initial list is due by June 30th. So today, but by the same token, if I wait another week, if I do it May 16th, May 17th, I still have that June 30th as my initial date.
And when you're talking about initial list here, that's capital I, capital L. That's the name of the form.
That is the actual name of the full name of the form is Initial List and State Business License Application. It's even for a state form, that's a very wordy title for the complete form, hence that we just kind of shorthand it as Initial List. And traditionally for us, again, because that's kind of a weird thing where you do this, it's not where we talked about California, where you at least have 90 days to your initial statement of information. Here, with that being, like I said, potentially, if I file on the 28th, potentially it's due within a month, really. Anyways, what we like to do is get people to file that at the same time. It cuts down on your fees if you're having someone file it for you, and it cuts down on thinking about something initially. You have all your ducks in a row at the same time. You go through it. We'll talk about it here a little bit more when we talk about like privacy concerns, because this initial list is very specific to what you have. So you may not be in that place when you first form it, but ideally we would like to do that all at the same time.
Let's come back to the initial list in a little bit when we talk about the transparency. You were talking about ways to streamline the costs. So what is the cost to file in Nevada?
So in Nevada, the filing fee for the formation is $50, and then the initial list is $25. So, and then again, as we've talked about, any service fees associated with the agent you have chosen. The most part, again, we've talked about this before, someone like CSC, someone like Rossi, someone like Paracorp, that will be your primary contact there. If anything does happen, your service, if something happens, if subpoena and stuff will go there. And the agent will supply an address for Nevada and provide in-state services then on that annual basis. And again, that's an additional cost. So again, if we have them file the $50 formation and then the $25 initial fee, after that, there will be an attendant service fee for each one of those services. That's what we were talking about, consolidating that background part. Keeps it cheaper. Yes.
I imagine these fees change from time to time. So what we're talking about today is just the cost as of May of 2023. The thing that often comes up in these registrations and new incorporations is how long it takes to get the filing back so that you can move on and open your bank account and do all those things. And we talked about California being notoriously slow at the moment and Delaware being incredibly fast. Where does Nevada fit in on the timing? Are they slow or fast?
So with the modern way of doing things, of doing this online, where you fill it in and pop it onto their system, their website, Nevada's right now notes that their normal online processing time for you doing it online is same day with no expedites attached to it. Last time I filed some was near the end of last year. I think that sounds about right. I got them back, I think, in a day. So about a 24-hour. I don't know if it was necessarily same day, but it was very rapid what we did in Nevada. Should you need to do a paper filing where you've got wet signatures and you need someone to drop it off into the thing, their current time for here in May of 2023 was noted as 4 to 6 weeks. And with those, you can always expedite depending on the needs, as we said. So those fees are $125 for a 24-hour expedite, $500 for a 2-hour, and then $1,000 for a 1 hour. Those are comparable to what we looked at in California in terms of like the expedite fees. It's kind of like I said, if you really need it that same day and you're doing something on the paper, it's expensive. It's not, like I said, we've gone from $50 to $1,050 if you need it in an hour.
So, and that's a lot like Delaware, right? It was
yes.
Delaware can turn it around really fast if you need to.
Yes, that is correct.
So, Joe, with fictitious entities like corporations, there's often this tension between privacy for the individuals involved and transparency for public oversight. How do the Nevada requirements fall in that spectrum from privacy to transparency?
So in terms of this, we talked going back to where we started with this, and people can listen back, but in Delaware, there's basically a high level of privacy and little transparency. When we talked about California, there was medium transparency in that officers needed to be named. As we go into Nevada and then we talk about Arizona here, they have a much lower threshold in that not only do the top level officers, the president, the treasurer, and the secretary need to be named, but you also need to name the directors.
Ah, okay.
And this is why we talked about potentially there being a time lag between filing your formation and filing your initial list of directors, in that we may be forming while the bylaws and the initial board is still meeting so that they have the entity in place when they have that first meeting. So there may be still some level of board members that haven't been approved or haven't
been
formally,
right.
Formally accepted. So that's one of the reasons this gives you a good break here in terms of that, if you need that, to make sure that you have your board in place and everyone is, again, we've talked about transparency. Some board members, if you have high profile board members, they may not want their names in public, such as this. So there may be concerns there about them not being on the board as they think about this being on the public record. So that's why we talk about that. And that's why maybe that's a good point here, is versus when we talk about Arizona, where it all kind of happens at the same time when you form. So you have to have your board in place when you do those filings.
Got it. A note to the listeners, a lot of this information becomes public eventually anyway, because the annual Form 990 lists the directors and officers, but the state registrations need to be updated typically more frequently. How often do you update in Nevada? Is there an annual filing, or is it more frequent than that? Some states, it's only every other year.
In Nevada, once the corporation is formed, the annual report is due, and it needs to be, just like we talked about the weird math of the initial list being due, it's the last day of the first month following initial registration. So the same thing we talked about, if I form today, May 4th, 2023, my first annual statement will be due by June 30th, 2024, and then every year thereafter. It is an annual one.
Okay, so you can just put that on your calendar, and every year you've
got a set date.
And I'm guessing there's a modest fee for that annual report. And then are there any other state agencies in Nevada that we need to think about?
Yeah, so taking the first part, the annual fee is $25, which isn't very, very expensive at all. And again, it's a simple form. It basically mimics the initial list, where you again reiterate your board and you reiterate your officers and go from there. In Nevada, while there's no need there to file with the state's attorney general's office to get an additional charity registration, I know, which we talked about in California briefly last time. But if you are soliciting funds in Nevada, you will need to file a charitable solicitation registration statement annually. This is also with the Secretary of State. That's why we talked about not being with the Attorney General. Everything on this side is more consolidated with the Secretary of State's office. If you do have sales and use tax exemptions, you'll need to file with the Nevada Department of Taxation, and they have a form that goes with that where you put your 501c3 and then use your registration. So that would follow after you've done your Nevada registration. Those are basically what you would look at to file otherwise in Nevada.
Super. Okay, so that covers the basics for Nevada. Let's talk a little bit about Arizona then. How does one go about forming a nonprofit corporation in Arizona?
Okay, so Arizona is unusual in that none of this is run through the Secretary of State there. Most states you do that. You get so many emails from people who say, oh, the SOS. In Arizona, it's the Arizona Corporation Commission, the ACC. And in Arizona, to register a domestic entity, one formed there in Arizona, they have a form, and the form notes a, quote, character of affairs, unquote, section that is used to note the type of nonprofit activities the entity will engage in initially. It does not restrict any future activity your nonprofit may have, but they want a base of where you're going to start. And it's a relatively simple form. It's not too complex other than that character of affairs section. A foreign entity, there is a different, even simpler form, which is called an application for authority to transact business or conduct affairs in Arizona. I think it takes longer to say the name than it does to actually fill it out. It's a couple of check boxes. And with either of these forms, the entity will also need to file a certificate of disclosure, which affirms this is much different. Again, we're back to transparency. The certificate of disclosure affirms that no officers, no directors have any felonies or any judgments against them, and that they have not been involved with bankruptcies that involve corporations. I went back over that again this morning to confirm it's not as an individual, but if you've been an officer or a director of a company that's gone, or a corporation that's gone bankrupt, then that needs to be disclosed as well. And that would be all the board directors and all the potential officers that you have on it. So that's kind of an interesting deep dive that you only see in Arizona.
Yeah, that is different. So filing fees, how expensive is Arizona?
Arizona, again, we're talking about something slightly different here in that we've talked about in California and in Nevada where it's the same fee all the way across. In Arizona, if you're forming there in the state, a domestic formation is only $40. But if you're a Delaware or California entity coming in as a foreign entity, it's $175. So they obviously encourage you to be a local business, in a local setup, which we didn't talk about. But again, if you're doing business there or not doing, if that's your primary place, perhaps that's an issue to think about versus the Delaware protections you get if this is something that you're just doing there. And we've already talked about it, but as always, remember there will be service fees associated with the agent you've chosen, and they will also give you a service address there in Arizona and take care of that side of things.
So timing, let's talk about that. So far we've got Delaware, Nevada can be really quick. California, there's different turnaround times depending on how you do it. What does Arizona look like?
At current, again, we're here talking in May 2023, Arizona's response time is noted as 14 to 16 days. I haven't filed one in about a year. We used an expedite, so we didn't wait for that because it was something we needed right away. And we're talking here, the expedite fees here for a corporation is they have different fees going across. So it's $35 to expedite, which Arizona notes as 3 to 5 business days. It's so nominal, I would probably do that automatically. No matter what, I would recommend that to anyone just to do that so that they were cutting it down. It's $100 for a next day expedite, $200 for same day, as long as it's received by 10 in the morning their time, and $400 for a 2-hour expedite, as long as received by 3 p.m. Again, really, in terms of how we've talked about expedite, even that 2-hour being $400, we just talked about Nevada a couple minutes ago, and we talked about California last time, where that's $1,000. Realistically, Arizona's not looking at their expedite fees as being exorbitant in the grand scheme of state secretary of states and corporate commissions. So it's not that bad. And again, I think I would just recommend, though, that you just use the regular 35 expedite as a matter of course. You just book that into your filing. Again, that would put your domestic formation as only $75 with an expedite to make sure you had it, which is, again, fairly reasonable.
Just briefly about the privacy versus transparency for filing in Arizona. What's the disclosure requirement at the start and then annually?
So as we just talked about a little bit with the Nevada, you do here too need to name all of your directors and the top level officers, the president, the treasurer, and the secretary. And that needs to be done with that initial formation document. You don't have that time lag between the formation and the initial list like we talked about in Nevada. So this is all real time with your formation. You do it all at once. So it's good to have all your board members on board when you're ready to form the company then, or register it, as the case may be.
And then there's an annual report. And I think this is a little different than Nevada.
Yes. In Arizona, actually, only corporations need to file an annual report. We were talking about using perhaps an LLC or a partnership. They actually don't have an annual report requirement in Arizona. Only the corporations do. And they are due exactly on the date of formation, and they are due annually. So if we form today, May 4th, I know May 4th, 2024, my first annual is due. May 24th, 2025, my next going forward. So it's really, I guess in one sense, it's simple. And yet on the other sense, if you're forming multiple foundations or multiple corporations over the years, you've got to remember what day you did it, because you don't have, like I said, with Delaware, we talked about it's always March 1st. In California, it's always the end of the month you're due. So you at least have, this one is very specific to a date. So again, it's not the end of the month like we talked even with Nevada, where it's always going to be June 30th if we form it today. Here, if we form it today, it's always today. I guess it's, in one sense, it's kind of like your car registration here with the DMV in California. Any
other state agencies relevant in Arizona? They don't have a corporate income tax.
So as of 2013, so about 10 years ago now, Arizona did away with their charitable solicitation registration. So a nonprofit needs to register with the Arizona Department of Revenue for tax exemptions, as we kind of talked about with a lot of these states already. But Arizona is very point specific on that. They don't offer an overall exemption for all nonprofits, but they allow exemptions only in certain circumstances. So the DOR, the Department of Revenue there in Arizona, has a list of the exemptions, and you have to go, then there's a form where you have to go through that and check which ones apply to you if you want those taxes. It's not, say, like here in California with the FTB, I just say, hey, I'm tax exempt. It's a simple, yes, I'm a tax exempt. Here's my IRS determination letter, and I send it. In Arizona, you have to actually check what specific part applies to you, and not all nonprofits will get that sales tax and use tax exemption.
So the biggest concern is keeping track of changes, I suppose. What do you suggest on that front?
as always, would check with the state websites. Go to, you'll see it in the show links here. There'll be an abundance of Nevada and Arizona links that are attached to this. Always check those. Like I said, check the fees one, check the forms one, because the forms usually forms are a January thing. They will solicit changes, and so especially at the beginning of the year, check and make sure the forms are up to date. Like I said, some of the forms we looked at, there's a 2016, then there's a 2018, and the forms will have it like in a parens at the bottom, usually when the last revision is. All states are very good about that, so you know where the revision is. So you want to make sure you've got that most common one. Again, that's usually check their website. They have links to the most common forms. Same thing, check the fees. The fees change. As we talked about with California, the state still hasn't said anything, but the $0 formation cost is set to expire June 30th, 2023. So in theory, July 1st, there will now be fees attached to that. So it's always good to do that. Again, when we do stuff, whenever someone asks me to form a company or to research this, or even to file the statements of information or the annual reports, I always go and make sure that it's the most common. Some of the states actually do, for the statements of information, actually do them specific year to year, where they have an annual one. You will download one and it will say 2023 statement of information. So a lot of the states are even that specific about it. So as always, you always have to check. Never, I guess, as we say in the legal business, always double check. Don't take anything for granted. Just because you did it last week, literally, you still need to go back to the state just to be on the safe side. That's always my mantra on that.
That's really good advice, because there's nothing more frustrating than getting everything all set up and actually filed and signed or whatever, approved, and then having to go back and do it again the next day because the wrong form was used or an old form was used.
Yeah.
So that's great advice, Joe. Thanks for all your thoughts here. I think we'll wrap up the episode on that point. For listeners that want to see more resources, check out the show notes for Nevada and Arizona links. And for more detail on California and Delaware, go back to episode 38. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.